Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to episode 013 of CodeWhile. In this episode, I'm going to add a replay button. Over at the top right of the page here, you can see a QR code, and if you scan it and follow the resulting link, you can follow along with the code on this same web page if you like. And on a lot of these web pages for CodeWhile episodes, you may be following along with the code, but this replay button that I'm going to add here will allow you to follow along with the code while also being able to replay the code sections if you like, so that you can carry on from where the episode leaves off. So let's see what happens here. Here I'm going to add a replay button. How does this work here? I'm going to use set timeout so that this function is going to get scheduled for a little later on. And inside, it's got some variables, div logs, replay button, replay string. I'm going to click it and show what happens and then go through the code with you here. Click the eval button. And what happened here? Okay, the first thing it does here is it finds the replay button if it exists on the page already. And if it already exists on the page, this function will just return. And why am I doing that? Just because if you use this replay button, this section of code is going to be invoked again, and we don't want it to create a second replay button, so that's what that check is for. Next, it creates this replay string variable by assigning to it the toString representation of replay, which is a function a little later on, and replacing that string for one or more spaces, replacing it with a single space, and replacing ampersands with the HTML escape for ampersand amp semicolon, and also replacing double quotation marks with ampersand QUOT semicolon. And that's to make it viable for an on-click attribute. That's why I'm doing those substitutions. And then this space substitution is just to make it more compact in the HTML representation. All right, so all of that gets assigned to replay string. And next, I fetch the logs element from the page, and I create a div element. Now here's an interesting piece of trivia here. In Microsoft Internet Explorer 6, if you set the inner HTML of this div, if you create additional sub-elements inside that inner HTML, and if they contain event attributes such as onClick, then any code inside that event handling attribute is going to actually have a different top-level scope where undeclared variables wind up than the window object that is commonly the case. So I've got a little comment about that. And down below, I append the div to the document via the logs as a sub-element of the logs element. And I do that first, and then I set the inner HTML for that div that was just attached. If you do it in the other order in Internet Explorer 6, you'll get some unexpected results. And then the function returns after adding that div. And what does that div have inside it? It has a button sub-element with an ID of replay button. That's the same one that was checked for a little earlier. And it has an onClick attribute, which just has a comma operator followed by the function that was built up in the replay_string variable from earlier. And then that expression, that's the comma expression, with the function as the second operand, it'll be invoked. So that's going to invoke that function. And I've used the comma operator here just for another quirk where in Internet Explorer 6, any function, if you get the toString representation of it, if it has left and right brackets around it, those will be incorporated into the toString representation. but if you use the comma operator, that's a workaround to avoid incorporating those brackets. And here's the replay function. It's got a bunch of variables here, and this isn't supposed to be compact or fast. This is supposed to be sort of instructive, so that's why it's very verbose, lots of variables here. The first thing this function does is to create a new function whose body is a try and a catch, and nothing is done for the catch section. And all that this try section is going to do is going to be to evaluate the first argument to the function. And so why am I doing this here? Well, when you use the function constructor to create a new function, you get a sort of a clean scope. None of these variables here are going to be incorporated into that function, for example. And I'm using 0,eval because in modern web browsers, at least, when you invoke eval in this way, it actually takes the code and evaluates it outside of the newly established function, even all the way up in a clean scope that is only secondary to the top level scope. So this is a sort of a blend of old and new, trying to make sure that it's as clean a scope for the code that gets executed as possible. All right, and next, I set this eval next text area to false by default to begin with. I fetch the logs element from the page, and then I iterate through the child nodes of the logs element here. For node equals logs.firstChild, as long as node is not null or a falsy value, the next iteration will go to node.nextSibling. And so for each of those nodes, fetch the node name, the lowercase node name of the node, and then I check that node name. I will only accept the P paragraph elements and the text area elements. Anything else, we'll skip over this iteration and on to the next one. But for P's, I set isP to true, and for text area, I set isP to false. If we get past that, if we have either a P or a text area, I'll fetch the subnode, the first child node of the node that was just established for this iteration, and then I'll check if it's null. If it has no subnodes, I'll just continue to the next iteration of the logs nodes iterations. Otherwise, if we get past that, I'll fetch the lowercase subnode name for that child node of the P or the text area. And what I'm expecting to find is the text inside there. So if the subnode is not text, we'll continue to the next iteration. If we get past that, then we'll set this text variable to the value of that subnode, that text subnode. Then, if this is a P, what I'd like to do is I'd like to check that that text ends with this pipe and code and a right square bracket. And if it ends with that, I know that the next text area is going to be some code to be executed. It's a code section from our logs. So if it matches, I set eval next text area to true. If it's not a P, this section gets executed, and I check if eval next text area is true, like it was just set for a previous P that had code at the end. Then if it's not set, I'll continue to the next iteration, but if it is set, we'll unset that eval next text area so that the next text area doesn't get executed, because we don't know if it's code yet until we get to a P that ends with code. And if we get past all that, finally, we'll run clean eval on the text, the contents of the text area for a code section. And after all those iterations are complete, all of the code sections, text areas have had their code reïnvoked. I'll make a little alert here that claims that the code sections were replayed. All right, what did we get from that? Because I used set timeout with a 0 there, this executed a little bit later on after this OK made it into a value section of the logs. So here I get a replay button. All right, well, let's give it something to replay here. I'm just going to alert 42 right now. 42, all right. Okay, so if I replay that, this section here ends with code. You can't see it hidden behind this QR code, but it does end with code. And so this text area that follows it should be executed. But then that's going to reset the eval next text area. And so this text area will not be evaluated as code because this doesn't end with code. This P doesn't end with code. All right, let's give it a try here. I'll click the replay button. All right, the alert for 42 was re-invoked. And we get an alert that says the code sections were replayed. So this could be handy for catching up where I leave off in these episodes, if you'd like to follow along with the code that's in them. All right, and one last thing to mention here is I will be adding that replay button to the top of the page in future episodes. Now, this is a user interface change. Episodes all the way from 3 have had this same sort of setup at the top of the page. But now adding a button there, that's a user interface change. So I'd like to share that I'm well aware of the very real suffering that is received by some users from vendors who are ignorant of the importance of consistent user interface. In particular, user interface changes can be pretty offensive to some neuroatypical folks. So it's very important to get this right from the beginning. And my excuse here for changing the user interface now is that these episodes are building a user interface altogether. And so code that's explored in one episode might result in a user interface element that then gets incorporated into future episodes, because these are educational. This isn't a product that I'm expecting everybody to use and to make money from. This is educational stuff, so it's building progressively a user interface over time. Now, having said that, I do have to apologize, though, because I could have made the replay button all the way back in episode 3. Anyway, I hope you'll join in for another CodeWhile episode. Have a pleasant day. Take care.